When they built it, they raised the whole level of the square and around the square by one floor. You have a lot of these double basements around.
Canadian bar owner Glen Emery points across the terracotta roofs to the St. Nicholas Church, which dominates the main square in Malá Strana, or the Lesser Quarter, the historic area below Prague Castle. We're just starting out on our tour of Glen's Prague, in a baroque garden with a fabulous view.
We're at the top of Vrtbovská Zahrada in Malá Strana. Some gardens that I think were completely rebuilt about 15 years ago. But back in the day, it was all closed and had been closed for decades. And all of these statues that you see around here were originals, at the time were originals made by Brown. I guess he was from the 18th century, who did most of the statues on Charles Bridge. But you can see that these have all been replaced with models. But back in the day, I sort of discovered this garden because we were coming down the hill here and we jumped over the wall into the church where the Bambino di Praga is. Then we jumped over another wall. Then we jumped over this wall. And all of a sudden we were in this garden, and we used to come in here all the time. We had it completely to ourselves. And we would sit and bring a few beers or a bottle of wine and sit up on the top here and overlook the city, and we had complete quiet. Most of these buildings were abandoned. This building where the Irish Embassy was completely abandoned, and this door here was open. And we used to go through that door and into the building. The first time I went in there, I walked all the way through. Everything had been ripped out, including all the wires and everything. I walked in and I went a little further, then I turned a corner and I saw over on a windowsill, I saw a telephone. I thought, oh, hello. So I went over and I picked up the phone, and of course there was a dial tone, so I called my mom. At the time I had Joe's Bar over here on Malá Strana. So I talked to my mom and my sister for about an hour. I went back to the bar and I told a few of the guys who were there from Canada, I said, come on, let's go, follow me. So we loaded up some wine and beer, and we jumped over all the fences, got into here, went through that door down there, and we sat in there for about 3 hours and called all of our friends. And this went on for months, and then one day we came in, and of course the phone had been disconnected. So,
what's your own connection to Malá Strana?
I've had a few. I opened like the first sort of North American bar here in 1992. Right after the revolution, and I lived here for over 10 years in Malá Strana.
That was Joe's Bar?
Joe's Bar, yeah. And recently opened another place a few years ago, just across the street here, called Napa Gallery and Bar. And now I'm living here again, down on Vrtbovská, just next to the Charles Bridge, so I have a long history here.
What's it like to live here? Because for me it just seems like tourist city, tourist central.
Yeah, but the tourists are pretty much concentrated on the square, Mostecka Street and Nerudova up to the castle. But there's a lot of places you can walk 5 minutes into Kampa Park, and all of a sudden it's completely quiet, and there's very few tourists. It's just local people, so it's easy to get away here because everything's quite close.
Do many regular people live here?
Do you mean like Czech people? No, I mean during communism they ran most people out of Malá Strana and gave the properties over to the apparatchiks. So there was a lot of real mean bastards in this part of town. There was a lot of STB characters and communist officials.
Also, you had here the embassies.
And the embassies, yes, all the embassies, and some places that were very famous during the 50s and 60s for entertainment, including all of Malá Strana, were completely decimated during communism. They got rid of all the famous pubs that were they used to be famous pubs, but then the communists turned them into sort of horrible restaurants, and it lost all of its flavor. And a lot of the places were completely abandoned, like Glaubitzu was completely abandoned, and so they sort of ruined the feel. In fact, when I opened my place in the early 90s, we got a lot of these Czech immigrants who'd been living in New York for 30 years come back, and they were telling me all the stories about living here in the 50s and 60s and how it was like the place to go. Start at the Black Bull at the top of the hill and then come down. It would be like a Friday or Saturday night and then end up in the old town. So, but the communists ruined all that. There's lots of beautiful little places like this in Malá Strana. I knew people who lived here for years and didn't know that you could go from the metro straight through that garden, and come out almost at Malá Strana. You know the one I'm talking about, where
the second stop on today's Glen Emery tour of Prague is the Augustinian St. Thomas Church, which dates back to the 13th century. Its courtyard is a wonderful oasis of peace, mere meters away from Malá Strana's bustling streets.
Sort of hidden down a little back street and off of Malá Strana, and it has this beautiful courtyard inside, which is open to the public, as you can see. Hello, some tourists, but very few people come out here. And there's all sorts of these old ancient crypts here that you've seen that are in this walkway in this area around the courtyard here. when I first came to Prague, it was joined up with this monastery next door. So St. Thomas was this brewery. They had it was like a monastery with a brewery that made its own black beer. They've recently reopened it, but it's all changed.
Is it a hotel now?
Yeah, it's a hotel. It's another one of these sort of, very expensive boutique hotels. But it used to be part of this complex. I guess the church sold it off for a ton.
Would you say there are many kind of hidden corners like this in Malá Strana?
Yeah, there's lots, and there's a lot that I've never seen, because every time I meet someone new who's living in a different building, you go into the building, they've got a beautiful courtyard with a beautiful view. So yeah, there's tons of little hidden quarters like this. A lot of them are accessible if you know where to go. There's a lot of little places you can have, access to if you know where to go. But there's also a lot of places that you'll never see because they're privately owned, etc. But when you get to a place like we were, either the castle or at the top of Vrtbovská Zahrada, you can look down into a lot of these places from up high. But yeah, there's tons of hidden spaces.
Also, I guess the government buildings are around here.
That's ubiquitous. I don't know how one government could take up so much office space in a city, but this country has an incredible amount of buildings that are just administration for some sort of office of the government. It's incredible.
I've got to say, I think it's kind of cool that the government is where it is in this historic, beautiful old part of the city, not in some modern building, a bit out of the centre.
No, absolutely. That's a good thing. So I've got no problem with that either. It's nice that the Parliament's just there. It's funny because sometimes you see the government ministers coming out in all the limousines, and then right there on the side street is a famous pub, and then you have these drunk guys rolling down the hill. It's kind of it's a classic Czech sort of situation, isn't it?
But also you get some of the politicians going to the pubs too, or the wine bars.
Going to the pubs, exactly. Well, even when I had Joe's Bar on the square here, we used to get a lot of the politicians coming in after they'd been out drinking somewhere else, and they'd come to my place because they reckoned nobody would understand them because it was all foreigners. But of course, a few of us did, and it was quite scandalous, I must say. Funny stuff.
After the pretty views and talk of quiet corners, it's time for a pivo or two. And Glen Emery, who today owns the lively Bukowski's bar in Žižkov, leads me to a popular spot at the Ujazd end of Kampa Island. Mlejnská kavarna translates as mill cafe, though it's widely known by the slangy Mlejn. I let Glen describe it.
Well, it's an old mill for a start, and it's a cute little place. You have to walk over a little bridge. There's a mill turning around. You've got the equipment right in front of us here. It's a very popular place in Malá Strana for the sort of younger, cooler set. It's not open so late. It's sort of an earlier place, although they do go. I think they have to close by midnight, but it's usually something happening till 1 o'clock.
Isn't this the place where Karel Schwarzenberg, the unsuccessful presidential candidate and foreign minister, goes to drink? At least I've seen him here.
Yeah, he shows up quite often, and I think that because the owner of this place, Martin Kotias, and David Cherny, and a lot of the other guys, what's his name, the economist,
Sedlacek.
Yeah, Sedlacek comes here, and they were all his big supporters. So this is sort of the grassroots, or I guess you could call it AstroTurf group started here, basically, for Schwarzenberg.
You've been working and living in this part of the city for 20 years or more, on and off. Are there a lot of the old school bars, or pubs rather, still in existence in Malá Strana? Yeah,
there's a few, not so many. I think the only one that is still in its original form is Učerného Vola at the top of the hill. Not necessarily that's a good thing, because they're snarly, burly, gnarly old guys who really bad service, but I guess it's got a certain charm. There's some of the old school places that have been redone. There's some new places that seem like old school places, like the Hippo, which has been there for 15 years, but seems like it's been there for 150 years. Glaubicu has been remodeled, which is also a good little hangout.
When you mentioned the Učerného Vola, does an old school pub like that welcome tourists or people who are outsiders coming in at all? Personally, I don't go to those places because I think they're not for me.
Yeah, that's the problem. You sort of get that immediate xenophobic reaction when foreigners come in and the locals are grumbling. But I've noticed that over the years they've seemed to have grown more accustomed to it. They're more welcoming, and there's only the one table in the corner. That's always a little bit. So
you daren't sit at the table where the old guys sit every night.
Yeah, and that's at the front. So, and then the back room is pretty much cool. It's not that bad anymore.
Otherwise, if we think about the whole of Prague, not just this part of the city, what are the particularly interesting pubs that you go to, or places that you would recommend to people?
Recommend to people. it's hard to recommend because everybody likes different things. I mean, I don't like noisy music bars anymore. I used to when I was younger. I like to go to a place where I can sit and talk with my mates and not have to fight over the music to hear somebody. And even the Golden Tiger is a great pub and they have good beer, but it's too noisy in there and there's too many taxi driver types and sport people. But Medvedka is one of my favorite. It's an evergreen, always good. The people are friendly, the pub's nice, the beer's good. Da, da, da. I like to go to Ukata, same thing. The music's low, it's a nice place, friendly staff. Where else do I go? I always like to poke my head into Chapeau Rouge, but after a certain hour. Also, some of the theater bars are cool. Some nice theater bars downtown.
When you mention the noise, I think that's to do with the acoustics. Even here, it's relatively noisy, say compared to a pub in Ireland or the UK, because there are open spaces with tiles, there's no kind of corners.
Yeah, it's true. They love their tiles. They love their tiles. Although, having said that, the Golden Tiger is a little it's different, and it shouldn't be bad acoustics. It's just what I've been in the Golden Tiger, and I made notice of it. I've been in there from opening until close one time with a friend. As people get drunker, the volume increases. That's where it comes from, basically. But you're right about the acoustics here, because there's a lot of tile floors, a lot of these brick floors, and they don't use carpets. There's not a lot of stuff on the walls, and you end up in these sort of echo chambers.
Canadian bar owner Glen Emery was Ian Willoughby's guest in this edition of My Prague. He showed Ian around his favourite spots in the capital.